Well, I'm delighted to welcome you all and thank you very much for coming today. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Professor Vincent Mor, and we're very, very fortunate to have such a distinguished speaker. Vincent were you a Boston boy? Because you definitely did your undergraduate in Boston.
I moved up to Boston from Washington and never left.
Yeah, decided he really liked it. He did his PhD at Brandeis and has been at Brown really since then for a very long time, but has built a stellar set of publications and clearly a very prominent career in the area of older persons' care. You're a named chair by the look of it, and also he's the director of Brown University Centre for Long-Term Care Innovation and Quality. He has numerous awards for his lecturing. Recent awards include his 2007 Brown University Distinguished Research Achievement Award, as well as the 2016 Robert W. Clymer Award from the Gerontological Society of America. I made the mistake of printing his CV, which is not a good idea when you're trying to save paper. But has well over 30 books and chapters, and has with expertise in his subject area, but also importantly in the conduct of clinical trials. And I know that he'll probably share some of that today. As well as over 400 peer review manuscripts. And probably a major career achievement. I mean, he has a long list of RO1s from the National Institute of Aging, but was recently successful in receiving an RO1 for $54 million for his work in trying to improve the quality of care for individuals with dementia. So I think he's going to be sharing many of talking about some of the topics that he's addressing in his grant, as well as the work that he's done throughout his career. So please join me in welcome him. Thank you.
So it's a delight to be here. I've had a wonderful time in Christchurch and New Zealand. It's my favorite place to be. I've decided that my wife and I would just love to come here every year for February and March, while there's one huge big snowstorm after another in the United States. It's just wonderful. We really enjoy it. And I've had a great time working with people here and teaching the students, both undergraduates and graduates here. So I'm going to be talking to you about work that I've been doing over the past 5 or 6 years, and that's an extension of moving forward as we try to implement some of this work that was required under this large grant. So it's essentially talking about designing and disseminating the next generation of interventions for persons with dementia. And it's a platform for understanding how you do trials, carefully and rigorous trials, but in a way that's pragmatic, that actually can be replicated in a functioning healthcare system, as opposed to just having researchers know the secret sauce, as it were. Some acknowledgements. Eric Jutkowitz did some of the work that this is based on in terms of the systematic review. Rosa Beyer is my co-director for this center, and lots of other Brown faculty. I have a large grant from the NIH Common Fund and another grant from the National Institute on Aging that I specifically will be talking about. So what I'd like to do is try to summarize the evidence on the effectiveness of non-pharmacological interventions that try to ameliorate the behavioral disturbances and consequences of the disease progression on both the persons with the disease as well as their caregivers, often family members. Because the important thing is to identify gaps in the readiness and how ready we are to take knowledge, quote unquote, that's published and actually get it embedded and adapted in a functioning healthcare system. Because, you know, despite what people in research laboratories think, what the real purpose of some of this stuff is to actually alter the way in which care is actually delivered. And that translational chasm is often given lip service And so that's essentially what some of the work we're focusing on, is to try to do more than give it lip service. We have a framework that we've developed for how ready a new idea is, or even an idea. I need this on so I can see it. How do I make this go? Yes?
Yeah.
I need to be able to, it's probably because I haven't done this well enough.
Okay, let's just see if this is working.
So we want to.
Okay, yeah, I might need to get some technical help because I didn't realise the screen wasn't going.
All right. So then I'm going to go back.
Yeah, so it's to do with the screen extension.
Control.
It's on PC, which is right.
Yeah. What did I do last time?
Just take that off for a moment.
Technology. The fancier it is,
Yeah,
the more catastrophic the likelihood of a breakdown.
It's slightly psychedelic with all the screens everywhere.
I was just going to turn it to the laptop and then turn it back
Right.
to see if it'll work. We're just trying to
Fine.
a few random things.
It seems to be.
Yeah, it does.
Hold on. We might need. No, that
Should I
was.
just get some
Yeah.
IT help? Eh?
What did I do last time?
Yeah, might. You have it on a memory stick, do you?
Yes.
Yeah, it's on.
Maybe I'll just grab my laptop.
Yeah.
Like, I can't see between. No, it's not there.
No.
Is that should be going? Is there any way the screen can be turned off?
No.
There we go. Can you go back one? I can go back one.
Yeah, you can go.
So let's try this then.
So you just turn them off. Oh.
I'll just move it back.
Yeah, I think you just might have to.
Yeah, from there.
No.
Is it not responding?
No, you're going to need to. I don't know.
But
Try that one now. Here you go.
I'm going to go back.
did you get it?
Here you go. That works now. That works. So you
Okay,
can stand and
perfect.
look at the screen.
I will.
Yeah.
Perfect.
You type it perfect.
Annoying.
Great. Okay, so I'll also then provide a few examples of these intervention readiness from research that I'm engaged in right now, and I'll put this over here so it can be taped, and then to consider the implications for what this would mean for doing larger trials such as the ones we're going to be engaged in. As a forward, just sort of giving you a premise of what the major message is that there are many interventions that are implemented by researchers, and they frequently show very positive results. 45 patients here and 45 patients there, and you get these nice effects on some behavior or something like that. There are many such studies, as I'll show you briefly. They're supposed to be done as a proof of concept, because ultimately you want the ideas to package them and make them implementable out there. But we rarely consider whether and how they would be adopted. So the original designers don't think in mind of, well, how am I going to think about this in the future? And questions we have to ask ourselves is, why isn't there thought about taking these ideas for interventions, which somebody spent a lot of time working on, and lots of theory supports, and then there's actually some evidence like a drug trial in a phase 2 or phase 1 drug trial, that it might work, but it doesn't work until it's actually out there working for many people. Just like presumably a drug is not working or a vaccine is not working until it's out there for lots of people. So it requires implementing interventions in the real world and thinking about interventions that are non-pharmacological, whether they're for people with dementia or kids, this is just as important. And this issue of translation is just as important for all populations. So what we did is we did a summary of research evidence, and Eric Jutkowitz has done this work. It was published basically doing a systematic review of what kinds of interventions have been effective in managing agitation and aggression in seriously demented older persons. And the target is for persons with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, ADRD. The outcomes often are mixed, but often something like quality of life, something like reducing behavioral issues. And the method of delivery is either directly to the person with ADRD in some way, or through the care staff in a care home of some sort, through a family member, through the environment, music or olfactory signals or things like that, or through some way through the healthcare system by training staff and otherwise. The challenge is that our interventions with persons with Alzheimer's or disease or related disorders is that the care staff, family members are often, these things are actually in most trials are done by researchers. So it's a trained psychologist or a very well-trained staff person who's done this and this. And they're researchers who are engaged in the implementation. They don't do the statistical analysis, but they do the intervention. They have multiple outcomes and measures, and so it's often not clear which one is the primary outcome. And it's often not clear what the criteria are for what success, how much of a benefit, and whether or not, what that benefit would mean in a broader application. And then, just as importantly, there are many, many studies like this that are done in small settings where, if you thought about it, nobody in a hospital or a care home or in a doctor's office would actually ever think about implementing it. It's too complicated and or requires too much training, and it's too expensive. It's just not practical from that perspective. So oftentimes these studies, when you do a systematic review, you find out that the settings in which those studies are done, they have been poorly described. And so it's very difficult to generalize from a setting where you don't know exactly how it's been done, where it's been done. The interventions, when you're doing a systematic review of things like this, they tend not to be well enough described in detail to be able to know that, so many units of this for so many days and so many time, you can't necessarily quantify the intervention. There's often inconsistent terminology, sometimes about the outcome measure, but certainly about the independent variables that are used to stratify. And perhaps most importantly, many of these are one-off studies. Somebody gets a grant, they pull their whole thing together, they have their idea, they got their paper, and they write that's their publication record over and over again, and they don't really care about whether it's actually replicated, or they'd like it to be replicated, but it's not their job. So this systematic review was a search of actual systematic reviews of other ones. We looked at what interventions were looked at, what outcomes were done, and then what were the results. These are the basic data methods for the overall systematic review. The population or individuals with dementia in care homes, in nursing homes or assisted living. The interventions were some form of non-pharmacological intervention. The outcomes were any outcome that was a measured outcome, but it was often focused on behaviors and aggressive behaviors in particular. And there had to be a comparator of one sort, preferable random assignment, but some kind of comparator group. So there were 383 references looked for, 77 had a full review from the pull, and 42 of these systematic reviews. These are systematic reviews of interventions. So people in the world of psychology and dementia have been very busy. So there's many hundreds of trials under this. But if you think about how often they're replicated, not all that often. Obviously, there were lots of complexity, there's scalability issues, and there are issues about the long-term fidelity, because often what happens is that these are interventions that are done, they're put aside, they're stopped, the researchers leave, and the place is sort of left to struggle on its own, and the half-life of these interventions after they're gone is like a nanosecond. Okay? And of course, their cost is often quite high, but it's often not even discussed in the papers because it's just researchers, so it's all embedded as part of the research costs. So I'm going to give you one example of an intervention and why it's complicated. It's something called dementia care mapping, which is the staff are trained or become experts in systematically observing a person with dementia. The feedback is provided to care staff about all of these little signals that the person is giving off while they're being studied and observed, and what that might communicate and translate that would be relevant to designing an appropriate intervention to calm them when they get agitated or to address their needs and issues when they occur. It takes expert training, labor-intensive, and quite costly to implement. And so whether it's scalable is highly questionable. There have been 3 efforts to actually do large-scale embedded replications of this thing called dementia care mapping. One by Chernworth, they basically did staff training of this dementia care mapping, followed by actual sessions done by both researchers and staff, sort of in parallel, sort of as a modeling exercise. The researchers implementing the dementia care mapping participated in many, many hours of the intervention procedure, so they were in fact in tandem with the care staff working on this stuff. Van der Ven in the Netherlands did 2 care staff were trained in this. All the staff provided high level of briefing on how to do it, and they did 2 cycles of this process, and then they studied what the differences were in the patient outcomes. And then Rockstad looked at staff trained in a care mapping by researchers and staff at the beginning of the study and then 6 months later. So there was sort of just one-off training and go and do this thing that you've been trained to do. And the care plans were implemented without researcher input, but based on the knowledge that the staff gleaned from the training by the researchers. So this is a classic standard results. The point is the point estimate, and so you can see that in the Chenoweth study, which had 159 patients in it, there was a reduction in the behavioral outcome of interest, which looked to be quote-unquote statistically significant using quote-unquote standard 0.05 estimates. The next one was also a reduction in the behaviors problems, not quite statistically significant. The sample size was 300 and stuff. And then the Van der Ven, which was, remember, much more hands-off on the part of the research, it was basically a null effect altogether. And then when you put these together in a meta-analysis framework, which is the bottom row, it does not look like a statistically significant indicator, and the costs associated with each of those, if you were to add them up, would probably not be something that a nursing home administrator or a care home administrator would say, oh yes, I definitely want to spend this kind of money. So translating these interventions into health systems programs is a real challenge. So researcher interventions are done in nursing homes. They're really quite separate. In other words, if I do an intervention, it's almost going to be in a separate wing, a specialized staff, or the chain, the nursing home company will say, oh, do it in this home, which has my best people in it, because, that way we'll actually do something. And that's, most people say, oh yeah, because I want to see it succeed. Even careful training of staff is not usual care. It's a very different kind of idea than normal. And integrating these new programs into existing care processes requires essentially re-engineering some part of the work of many of the people who are engaged in that process, in a care home or in a home care. Certainly, if you're home with your family member, you've got to retrain that family member, because there's probably all kinds of there's probably some psychologists in the room, all kinds of funny behaviors that go on between family members and their demented older loved ones. So to really test whether an evidence-based intervention can be implemented, you need to actually think about this as an embedded, pragmatic clinical trial. It has to be embedded in a healthcare system, has to be relatively pragmatic, has to be adopted by the company, by the healthcare system, and presumably it should be a trial, because you've got to understand there's the efficacy trial of a small little group that shows that when it's done by researchers it can be effective. To actually get it done in the real world, there's this huge chasm of translation that has to happen. And it's probably not a good idea to try to take apart each one of those little components and do a big trial on all of them, because you'd rather actually see how it would work if it were implemented in the real world setting, which is, I did something wrong. Oh, sorry. Did I do this right? Yes. Okay, great. So I've done trials, big, large, cluster randomized trials that were really easy. I substituted one vaccine for another vaccine. Everyone's going to get vaccinated. It was very high compliance. It was a piece of cake. You go in, you just give them a different kind of vaccine, and everybody in that building gets the new vaccine, because they were going to get the old vaccine anyway, for influenza, for example. It was the easiest study ever done. What's really surprisingly complicated is actually saying, oh, we've got a video for you, really very simple. You just offer it to everybody who comes in the door and or people who are there, and then we think that those videos will stimulate people to want to have discussions about advanced care planning. And then the doctors would just do their appropriate thing of writing in the chart what the preferences are. I can tell you it's really much more complicated. Much more complicated. People turn over, they leave, they go someplace else. It's actually not so simple to say, here, see this video, because that's one of 17 things that are happening as somebody is inducted into a care home or other kind of setting. Imagine that, for those of you who have a clinical background. Oh, we're going to do that in the emergency department. Yeah, right. We're going to stop all that stuff so that the emergency department can do it? No, I don't think so. We have to figure out some quiet way to have it done. And so it's much more complicated than that. And then this, we're doing a study now, I'll describe a little later, on music and memory. And there I have to get the activities people involved in figuring out what kind of music people like, or if they like it at all. And then they have to get the aides who are there to use, to help the staff, the persons with dementia, apply the music at a time of agitation. And so that is two departments, two different groups. You have to get them all on board. And it's hard enough to get one group on board to have two groups on board. And then I've just finished a very large cluster randomized trial of something called Interact, which we train nurses to identify the early signs of patients in nursing home or the care settings beginning to go south, as it were. And they There might be swelling, there might be some signs of a little confusion, of an emerging delirium, because they could have an infection emerging. So you want them to be very sensitive, and so you want to structure how the nurses then communicate that to the doctors, who then have to decide, oh, you could try this and this and this, rather than just send them to the emergency room, which I'm assuming must happen here just as much as it happens in the US. That is unbelievably complicated to do. You need to get nurses to trust the aides. You need aides to trust the nurses, that the nurses will do something. And you need the doctors, most importantly, to trust that the nurses are communicating something in the same way their residents would were they in a practice setting. And it's really hard to get all that trust when you have, oh, we're going to train people. It's very, very complicated. So then the issue is, how complicated, how replicable, how pragmatic does it have to be? So there's for those of you who do cluster randomized trials or trials of some sort, there's something called the PRECIS system, which is for looking at, refers to both trial design and implementation design, and the flexibility in the organization of its intervention. And so I'm going to apply this now to this study of Proven, which is basically this video-assisted advanced care planning approach in a nursing home setting. So we're going to look at this is the PRECIS domains, the implementation domains, and we're just going to look at adherence and delivery and organization. Okay, so, and how we in our study had to work as researchers with the clinical people in the setting. So with organization, we have training, and the research team, RT, developed the training materials. We printed things out. We, trained them, had a video and all that other kind of good stuff, the way you're supposed to do training, all with adult education ideas. The challenges were, and then the healthcare system people, they actually implemented that by using I think one of them has some online university for pushing out training programs, because they have 300 some nursing homes, so it's a big deal. But the healthcare system had different preferred modalities. One of them did it in person, and one of them did it through this a video approach. But every time a champion who was supposed to be showing these videos left the organization, they had to retrain them, had to figure out what the right time was. And someone had to remember in, Care Home 22 that, oh yeah, this is the project we're doing, as opposed to what is this, little device that we left under somebody's bed. And it gets very complicated, the personnel. So there's issues of turnover, and there's also a tablet gets stolen or a tablet gets lost. That's the intervention. But it's not even the money. It's just all of a sudden there's this place that doesn't have a way of doing the intervention at all. So the mechanics of getting this done get very complicated. So in implementation, so we had a protocol-driven approach. The research team set up guidelines for when the videos should occur. They should occur, within X number of hours. They have flexibility for which video to show, depending on the conversations. And so there were flexible guidelines for exactly when and which videos could show, because there was a bunch of different videos that could be done. So patients who were being admitted, they were offered the video, but often they were offered as sort of a peremptory, you don't want to see this, do you? Because if you do, it's going to take me more time. And since all I had to do was offer it, that was the check. Oh yes, let's check, that's done. I've offered it. So for the long-term care patients who were there, who were probably the most important target, it was really hard to find the right time. And doing it at the care planning session became immediately impossible to do, because the care planning sessions weren't actually set up for the patients. They were set up for the staff to communicate with one another, just like medical practice is set up, and the patients are aside and the doctors have the communication, or the nurses and the specialists. So this became a real issue as we were doing implementation. And then with respect to adherence, we tried to, with our partners, the healthcare systems, to say, you know, rather than randomly assign all of your homes, why don't you just take the best 120 or 150, and then we'll randomly assign them. Please drop out the guys who have just lost their director of nursing, have just had a crisis inspection, so that you wean out those people, and then we'll do the study on those. So it's still reasonably okay. We figured it dropped the top 5 or 10%, and they actually even did that. But the crises that happen in these places, in most organizations, are pretty much constant. They're just a question of how big they are. But there's some crisis that is occurring all the time. And it's more important than some silly new thing that we're adopting, because the crisis is going to undermine our ability to survive as a company. So it became a real challenge. And so ultimately, we really began to focus as a research group on actually showing the video to the target population of people with severe dementia and or severe functional impairment and cardiovascular disease who have the highest risk of being hospitalized and therefore have the greatest possibility that if advanced care planning is done, a hospitalization might be appropriately deferred, because hospitals can kill old, frail people. So that's the structure and the problem of this implementation. We go back to why we do trials in the first place. Once approved, pharmacological treatment is just sent out, and actually we probably all count on the pharma, the drug companies, to sell, and they do sell. And they are, in some sense, the effort to disseminate interventions. There's nobody doing that for non-pharmacological interventions. There's nobody who's pushing a labeled, branded, and expensive product. So pharmacy-based treatments are also relatively simple. You get nurses to pass meds. They may or may not be effective in the population simply because they're already taking 16 other medications and you can't tell the difference as to what the effects are. But pharma's already been approved under a rigorous trial, which is never replicated in the real world with real patients. So non-pharmacological treatments require both not prescribing and doing something different. So that's really important. So there are very few people who are prescribed music and memory. I mean, it's a nice thing to have, but there's no formalized structure for doing that in our healthcare system. That could be appropriate as an idea, but it's not done. Additionally, the way we've learned how to engineered care homes and hospitals to pass medications is uniform across every place. That's done regardless, because errors in passing medication are sort of critical errors, and it has to be as close to zero as possible. Whereas other kinds of treatments, they're not going to be standardized, and there are different ways in which they affect the ongoing operations of those systems. So, when is an intervention ready for diffusion in the healthcare system? When do we know, it's ready to be replicated and embedded? And we're still worrying about how to do this properly, because some things, the replication is necessarily so different than the original trial that it's not even sure that it's the same thing anymore. But I'm still at least grappling with that as an issue. So you want to replicate it so that it's under the control of the healthcare system, which means that the healthcare system has to have a provisional idea that this is going to be viable effective, and it will not be so disruptive that it will be really not adopted and embraced. Okay? Because they're controlling it. So we created something called RAPT. I think it's been published, but I don't actually know anymore, which is Readiness for Assessment of Pragmatic, for Pragmatic Trials. It's just the same idea as the PRECIS, and every study can be rated accordingly in terms of, is there really a protocol sufficiently detailed to be replicated? Does such a thing exist? And you probably need to do that. Secondly, is the evidence there for its being efficacious in a small setting before replication? Is it safe? Can we get waiver of consent, for example? Is it feasible? Can you actually get the mechanics done in some way? If you actually did the engineering work, could you actually get these people to move in this particular way necessary to make it happen? Are there measures for measuring the outcome that you care about, and how would you measure those systematically in a way that the company itself will believe, yeah, it's worth the effort. I'm getting enough of a delta here that it's worth it. Is it too expensive? Is it impossible to do? Would it be acceptable to the providers? Will the nurses do it? Or will they think it'd be a waste of time? Is it aligned with the mission, which could be for profit or social, of the healthcare system? And how useful will the results be? I'm going to tell you a story now. One of my colleagues, there's a consortium of groups doing these large cluster randomized trials in the States, and one of my colleagues worked with a large company called Hospital Corporation of America, and they were going to actually do universal daily baths in every hospital for every single patient with chlorhexidine for infection control. Now, just think about every single patient, every single day gets a sponge bath or something like it of this little green soapy solution and so on and so forth, which is, and they did this in 25 randomly selected hospitals, and 25 hospitals were the controls. They got, she's the most amazing person in the world, 82% of the patient days had a bath in those 25. I just couldn't believe it. But you had really good documentation. They had all these obsessive compulsive aides going around counting things and things. It was just astounding. Their primary outcome was overall infections for the overall population. The effect was not statistically significant at their prior a priori level, but as soon as they, and this has just been published in either BMJ or Lancet, I don't remember which one, once they looked at people who had some kind of tube, hole, wound or something like that, where 70% of the infections actually occurred, the effect was very large. So Hospital Corporation, one of the biggest healthcare systems in the country, said yes. And literally within a month or 2 months of getting the results privately from the investigators, they put the policy in place. Anybody with a tube, toe, or something like that wound in any of their hospitals, daily bath. And it's done. So she actually did some of the similar kind of work on ICU beds and stuff like that. But and the effect and the willingness of the company to respond, I mean, that is sort of like the most ideal. Because this is real work that the nurses and the staff have to do. Much different thing in other kinds of settings. But that's, in my sense, that's kind of the goal. That's the gold standard for what an effective treatment pattern is. So the video-assisted advanced care planning, this is sort of how we began thinking of it. The implementation protocol was absolutely ready to go out of the box. The evidence base was not perfect, but okay. Very low risk in the population. We thought it was more feasible than it actually has turned out to be. The cost, we're not 100% sure about. It does take away from other staff activities, but not a huge amount, because staff are always making choices as to how they do, what they choose to do. It was greatly aligned with the goals of the companies, because the desire is to reduce the likelihood that patients from the home go to the hospital. And if you can reduce that, they look better to the rest of the healthcare system, and those are actually publicly reported quality measures of hospitalization for people in the nursing home. And so that aligned very nicely with their interests. Here's a study I'll describe in just a moment, music and memory. The evidence base, amazingly enough, in spite of the wonderful video and the movies that have been done about this, and it's being promulgated all over the country, at least in the US and probably internationally, the evidence base is actually lousy. The evidence base is even lousy for actually monitoring, watching behavior change for people, because it's just not been published much, and for actually doing it as a full intervention in a care home, there's just no evidence whatsoever. Risk, we felt that there might be some risk, because people might get up and dance and fall and break their hip, but that's probably not as big a deal. There was some alignment, because staff have very strong interests and connections with these patients who have severe dementia, and as they become agitated, it's big and disrupted for everybody. So something other than a drug that would ameliorate that, and there are quality indicators about using drugs too much, would be highly desirable. So it's a useful strategy for thinking about what's available. So what is music and memory? It's a personalized memory program. Staff identify music that a nursing home resident or someone with significant dementia had, as long as they like music, when they were 13 or 14, when all of those words and tunes are sort of hardwired into the brain. So John's going to be listening to the Beatles when he's old and demented. I'll be listening to the Rolling Stones. And there are thousands of nursing homes that have tried it, but only a small proportion of them have actually figured out a way to actually incorporate it into daily care. And so entire states have made this a big quality improvement initiative, but most of them sort of stopped, because the little iPods or whatever it is get hung up on the cubby someplace, and people forget, well, where's the playlist and what was that? And the staff turn over so much they don't even know what it is when they come in, 5 weeks or 7 weeks later. So embedding these into the culture is the challenge. And so rigorous evaluation has not happened, and that's what we're now doing. So we did a pilot, and I've just randomly assigned 81 nursing homes across 4 different groups to do this trial, sort of what's called a wedge design, 27, 27, 27, and there'll be successive control groups out of that. But we did in our pilot, we looked at 4 nursing homes, one each from 4 different small nursing home companies. There were 47 residents who were looked at very carefully as part of this process. They all had moderate or severe dementia, mostly quite severe. They received this music and memory program. Someone figured out what kind of music they liked. They had their little earphones or earbuds or whatever. Some of them had a speaker or something like that, because they didn't like things on their ears. 34 of the 47 residents were seen at more than one occasion, before and after the treatment. And we measured directly agitated behaviors by speaking with the staff and observing the resident. And so, again, this is not at all pragmatic. So we found within person, this is now unpublished, I think this is under review, I believe, I never remember. I don't want to do this. So there's the total score on this Cohen-Mansfield agitation inventory was a very significant drop. also in physically aggressive behavior, and these are actually really aggressive behaviors. They're very detailed, specific behaviors about that. And then physically non-aggressive or verbally agitated behaviors. And so all of this showed a significant effect for the people pre and post exposure. And then this is, the challenge is now to keep it embedded for these people over a regular time. And to think about it as a prescription rather than getting Ativan or some nasty drug 3 times a day. You're going to get this music at appropriate times during the day when the staff who know you well enough say, oh yeah, it's going to be right before lunch they get really agitated, or at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon they get agitated, or sometime in the morning when they have to be dressed, or what have you. There are various times. And so we're now doing this large step wedge design. And for the first 2 waves, we are going in with researchers to measure the outcomes of these behaviors. And for the second and third waves, we're relying on the existing data, sort of something like an inter-eye kind of assessment that's being done, which characterizes behavior from the staff point of view, which they code. It tends to be, staff tend to be, they normalize behavior that you and I would say, oh, that's really not right, because they see it all the time. And because of that, it's a more muted measure. And so we have all these fancy statistical mumbo-jumbo ways of taking the 2 sets of measures and interpolating them and getting a better measure out of that. So that process is underway now, and what I'll be doing over the next 5+ years is we are being funded to serve as an incubator for 30 or 40 new pilots across the entire country for not just care homes, but even doctors' offices, emergency departments, and so on and so forth, where different kinds of non-pharmacological interventions, which could be very light touch, could affect the way in which people respond to either the patient's behavior or training the family to adapt to it and understand it better, and so on and so forth. Because it's really not enough for the researchers to test these things and then to say, oh yeah, somebody else's job to do the dissemination and implementation. If the goal is to actually affect the lives of this population, or children, or whatever, whichever population it is, you actually have to engage with the healthcare system, which is, in our societies, charged with this activity. Education is the same kind of thing. Schools could be doing the same kinds of things, and in some sense do, but I just know much less about that in my world. So that means that the researchers have to partner and be able to communicate with people from healthcare systems, and the communication and cultural chasm between those 2 sets of actors is quite broad, but it does need to be approximated if what the researchers care about, which is to affect population health, is to actually have any likelihood of being observed or achieved. So thank you very much.
So I'd like to open the floor for questions. I do have, it's fascinating because I'm sort of at the other end of the lifespan.
But it's just as applicable.
To develop interventions, and I'm doing it in a single setting. So doing it in multiple settings just kind of blows my mind, because we had very similar experiences with sort of music therapy.
Yes.
Why isn't it happening? All the stuff's in the box.
Exactly.
Because something else is more important. But I'd be really interested in your thoughts about some of the kind of, in terms of the future for non-pharmacological interventions, because obviously it would be much nicer not to be, prescribing cocktails of drugs for elderly people, which is kind of like a chemical straitjacket. What do you see as the sort of major themes or directions that for successful interventions in this population?
So for the persons with dementia, you actually, there's just no substitute for intervening with the people who are their caretakers. And to do that, you need to educate them, and you need to alert them to behaviors, and that requires understanding more about what those behaviors might mean, which is highly personalized. Ulrich used was it mass customization notion here. Every person who's demented is a little bit different. There's and worse is, of course, as their brain continues to deteriorate, they're actually changing as well. But there are certain principles that I think are probably helpful, which the caretakers have to be willing to inculcate. And programmatic initiatives can actually, I think, be effective in making that happen. Because people won't, the staff or family members, don't learn when they're in the midst of trying to cope with aggressive behaviors. They have to learn in a group kind of setting, and they have to then have practice at trying these techniques and then seeing how they work, making modifications and seeing how they work. In the States, at least, use of antipsychotic medications for people with dementia in nursing homes is dropping very quickly. There's some suggestion that it's probably not because of the introduction of non-pharmacological interventions, but because of the substitution of other kinds of drugs. But there's still work that needs to be done on that. Internationally, there's huge variation from country to country in terms of the proportion of people in care homes who are taking these kinds of drugs. And so another example was in the US, probably 20, 25 years ago, as many as half of the residents of these homes were physically restrained. That's now about 2%, maybe 3%, 2%. But in Ontario, it's still high, 20, 15% or higher. And in other countries, it's even higher, very high.
Does the underlying cause of the dementia, is there any correlation between that and any of the effects? What I'm really asking is, should you be subdividing your subjects in terms of what you know or can divine, I suppose, as well, about the underlying cause and development of their dementia?
So my work is mostly with people with advanced dementias who are older. And I'm not a neurologist. I happen to have been looking at this fairly carefully. And the older the person, the less differentiation there is in quote-unquote dementia subtypes. So the question you're really asking for a 60-year-old with Lewy bodies versus a 60-year-old with classic Alzheimer's versus a 60-year-old with, let's say, multi-infarct, stroke-based kind of dementia. Is there some difference? And the answer is we haven't got a clue.
And well,
to my knowledge,
I'm interested in young adults, like children, particularly with neurological disease.
Yeah. So I don't know anything at all about it. I'm ill-informed. So for people with AIDS-based dementia, AIDS-initiated dementia, again, it's unclear what the phenomena are and their responsiveness. The idea behind the music, for example, is that the memories are so hardwired, so rooted, that as the person with advanced dementia gets confused and overwhelmed by all the stimuli going on around them that they don't comprehend any longer. They can't make sense out of the various actions because they no longer can interpret them properly, and they worry that there might be threats. The music, the idea behind the music is that it puts them back into a more comfortable mindset, and it soothes that sort of crescendo of anxiety. That's the idea. There's nobody who's yet, there's some people in North Carolina who are beginning to do some PET scan work with this music idea, functional imaging.
Yeah.
But the results are complicated. So not my world.
What percent of people with dementia have got agitated behavior?
So some people argue that at least half will sooner or later, as their dementia progresses, exhibit aggressive, hallucinatory and other kinds of behavior, which is at least episodic. So it ends, cumulatively, it's a fairly high proportion. But at any given cross-section, environmental effects are quite influential. So you can look at the same kind of a person in one care home, which is, has lots of turnover of staff, and there's nobody who the person recognizes for soothing and things like that, and there's no memory of the culture to how to work with that person, and that person will manifest far higher levels of agitation than in another place where there is more common identity. Now, it also is the case that as somebody's neurons continue to get scrambled, boom, they're hallucinating and paranoid all the time.
So has there been studies done where they have tried music as therapy in non-dementia agitated persons, like some prisoners or whatever?
So this music and memory notion has been anecdotally shown to be effective for people with schizophrenia and other kinds of psychoses who are not old and demented, but their brains aren't working right. But that's idiosyncratic. No one's studied it, to my knowledge, systematically.
At one stage, you were mentioning the patient and going to the patient. One of the things I find most difficult as I get older is keeping up with the modern computer and those sort of things. It's a bit like the Boeing 737, the modern aircraft that's going into the ground, and it's got so much modernness that the pilots can't cope with the thing. So I would feel that I would go demented and aggressive and paranoid from a computer that doesn't work, or in the old days, every boy could fix a car. Nowadays,
no one can fix cars.
Is there any point going back in time and giving them no computers, but things that they can do?
So this issue of music is the reason to have this iPod is to personalize it, so that you have your own playlist. Because if you just pipe music into the common room, it doesn't work. And not everybody likes polka, And so that's the idea. These are very simple devices, and so you could put it on repeat. They're just this little things like that. And so it's not a computer per se. It's just you just press a button to listen to the song again or a new song.
And people must, I would imagine people must feel useful. Is there anything, a really good demented person, can you get them to feel as though they're doing something useful?
So that's generally speaking with people with more mild dementia. This is quite sort of root stem dementia. These are very demented people who are otherwise might look a little catatonic, and the music will stimulate them because otherwise they've just sort of shut down or will have episodic behavioral issues. This is not somebody struggling with memory or executive function, which is, I think, much more to your point.
Perhaps it was Richard Gary. Do you think it was Richard Gary you met this morning?
He's the chairman of the department?
Yeah.
Yes. Perfect. John.
Yeah. You mentioned pilot studies before you looked at the pathway, and you mentioned that it wasn't very pragmatic. How pragmatic?
It's a great question, and actually I don't know the answer. I don't know that there's an absolute answer. It probably depends a little bit about the complexity of the intervention, and you have to push the button, about the complexity of the intervention. And the way I think about it, we have a paper on this topic, is the more different departments, that is different groups of people that are involved in having to coordinate their activities and or have their activities re-engineered a little bit, the more complex the intervention. And it's probably, when you go from one department to two departments, it's not linear. It's probably logarithmically more complicated. But it's a really good question. We're struggling with that now to say, oh, here's a pilot, we can do it in 4 different places. So we did this pilot in 4 different places. And each place we came up with sort of a slightly different strategy for training the staff and getting them to identify, what's the best place given the workflow for these devices to be located physically. What's the best way the activities people who could do some of the diagnostic work could communicate that to the aides. It's not, so that is in some sense the notion of some kind of customization, because these interventions are really not plug and play. It's not like distributing pills. Yes, ma'am.
3 quick things. First of all, my mother, who was blind with macular degeneration, but when you just have the ordinary old transistor radio, so I heard music on the program that had continuous music, and that worked actually for her. It's simple, very well. But I was going to ask you, how do you leverage lobby this week? It was reported, I think, on our radio this week, from aged care, this huge shortage of workers. The person had 15 minutes to wait, dress, shower, clean teeth, do hair, leave the next one. And was saying, look, this whole sort of money, motivation, time, training thing.
So that's, that's an overarching, broad concern in the U.S. I tell anybody who cares to listen. When I go to a conference in Washington, D.C. or something like that, my hotel room costs almost twice as much as a day of 24-hour nursing care, food, and medicine for the person who lives in a nursing home down the block. And those are national policy decisions that we decide to make, and for better or for worse. And, those are big picture policy questions. Yes?
So along this similar line, do you have any recommendations in regards to how to approach funders for that kind of translational research? It's quite different to point efficacy trials.
So in the U.S., the National Institutes of Health, this has been for the past decade an increasing area of interest. And part of it is because even drugs, biologics, and devices, which go through the FDA process, are increasingly complex in terms of how they get applied and implemented, who's triaged, who gets them and who doesn't get them. And so that even the translation of real efficacy findings in a phase 3 trial for people getting this particular package will sometimes fall down in how it's actually implemented, either not be adequately implemented or implemented quite incorrectly with lots of adverse effects in the population. And so people began to realize that whether it's heart, lung, and blood, or the National Cancer Institute with very complicated kind of trials, is that a lot gets done and a lot of mistakes can get done in these complicated things. And so how it's implemented after approval is of great concern. And some of the policy people within the National Institutes of Health actually have said, yeah, this is important. And it became important statistical questions as well for people doing cluster randomized trials. And so lots of other people got on board. But it was literally originated by the concern regarding regarding how to generalize.
As a country doctor, years and years ago, out in the bush in Australia, one of the most important things to me was to give a person a good death. One of the ways, the people who had the best death, probably, in my opinion, were the Roman Catholics. Called Father Mor, he would come and give the last rites. That would help the family quite a lot. Do you find that in your healthcare people, do you find a difference in the different religions or anything like that?
So, yeah, I mean, in the U.S., we don't collect religion data. I wish we did, but there are all kinds of anecdotes and little studies and so on and so forth say that, Jews will go for the last gusto in the ICU, and Catholics will do a different set of things. A lot of those are, particularly in our society, which is much more heterogeneous across within as well as between religious groups, subgroups. There's a huge amount of heterogeneity, and probably the dominant mode is that the healthcare system gets you unless you work really hard to stay away from it.
Maybe one more question? Yeah.
I just want to take it back to the context you were talking about before so that I can understand the context of nursing home residents and assisted living residents as opposed to or palliative care with what we get here in regards to the patients with dementia.
So in the U.S., nursing homes serve a combined long-term residential for really sick people and post-acute for rehabilitation for financing reasons that you don't want to know about. The assisted living are probably much more in general like your care homes here because they're people with increasing levels of impairment, and many of them have dementia special care units in the assisted care units.
Locked units.
Yes. Yeah. Now there are some nursing homes that will have locked units as well, but those people in the nursing home for the seriously demented people, they often are not able to get up and walk much.
Yes, so they're often not exhibiting behaviours that.
Well, they do because they will yell and be uncomfortable, and presumably you must infer that they're in considerable discomfort or psychic discomfort, but it's very difficult to know because you can't communicate. So that's the context. So for our work, we do look at nursing homes because, frankly, that's convenient where the data are, but assisted living is moving along in the same direction.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. I'm glad.
Thank you. Please join me. Thank you. I'm sure he'll be happy if you have
Happy to talk.
questions. Yeah, feel free to come on.
Just say, Vincent's going to head off to the staff club.
I am. I need a beer.
You want to progress the conversation anyway. We're going to be able to start also.
Well, there you go.